Have you ever felt the world shrink until it was just you and the walls and the deafening silence of what's missing? That's where Daniel lived. Not just in the small, slightly shabby Victorian on Elm Street, but inside that crushing quiet. It was October 17th, a Tuesday. Rain lashed against the bay window like frantic fingers trying to get in, or perhaps like memories trying to get out. Outside, the world was a blur of wet pavement, skeletal trees clawing at a bruised sky, and the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves that clung stubbornly to the air. Inside, it was the smell of dust, stale coffee, and grief. 3 months, 92 days since the heart attack stole his father. Since the phone call that turned Daniel's world upside down and dumped him back into this house. His house, a place thick with 60 years of his father's life, and now just boxes. Boxes Daniel couldn't bring himself to unpack. Boxes filled with photos, old sweaters that still held a faint scent of pipe tobacco, books with cracked spines, relics of a man who was suddenly, irrevocably gone. Daniel sat at the scarred oak kitchen table, untouched coffee cooling in a chipped mug bearing the faded logo of a hardware store his dad had loved. He traced a groove in the wood, worn smooth by decades of his father's absent-minded tapping. The silence pressed in, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of him. The rumble of the old furnace kicking on, the creak of the floorboards under familiar weight, the low hum of the radio perpetually tuned to the jazz station, all gone. Replaced by this void. He'd moved back from the city, leaving his barely started graphic design career on indefinite hold. Guilt, a cold, heavy stone in his gut, told him he should have been here more. Regret whispered that the last argument about Daniel's impractical career choice, about the city changing him, was their final conversation. Loneliness, his most constant companion now, wrapped around him like the worn flannel shirt he hadn't taken off in days. He felt untethered, adrift in the sea of his father's belongings, drowning in the silence. He was supposed to be sorting, clearing, moving on. But every object was a landmine. Every room echoed. He felt like an intruder in his own childhood home. The back door, leading to a small, overgrown yard choked with neglected rose bushes and a sagging wooden fence, rattled slightly in a gust of wind. Daniel barely registered it. He was staring at a water stain on the ceiling tile, tracing its familiar shape like a constellation, a habit from childhood. Then a sound. So furtive. A scrape against the door. Not the wind this time. Something deliberate. Daniel pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly on the linoleum. He crossed the small kitchen, the cold from the door seeping through his socks. He peered through the rain-streaked glass of the top panel. Nothing. Just the blurry gray smear of the yard. He was about to turn away, blaming the wind or his own frayed nerves, when he saw movement. Low to the ground, against the foundation of the house, trying desperately to find shelter from the driving rain under the narrow overhang. He unlocked the deadbolt, the click unnaturally loud. Slowly, cautiously, he opened the door just a crack. The damp, cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of wet fur and something else, wild, earthy. A small shape flinched back into the shadows beside the step. Daniel crouched down, squinting through the gloom. Two eyes, wide and luminous, reflected the dim kitchen light. Not yellow, but an intense, startling green. They stared at him, unblinking, filled with a wariness that felt bone-deep. It was a cat. Tortoiseshell, her fur plastered dark and muddy against her frame, making her look even tinier. She was shivering violently. Not just from the cold, Daniel sensed. It was a tremor that seemed to come from somewhere deeper. Fear. Exhaustion. Her ribs were visible beneath the wet fur. One ear had a small, jagged notch missing from the tip, a pale scar cutting through the dark fur there. She didn't hiss, didn't growl, just stared, frozen, utterly still except for the relentless shiver that racked her small body. Daniel hesitated. He wasn't a cat person, hadn't had a pet since childhood. His dad hadn't been fond of them either. Independent critters, he'd grumble. Come and go as they please. This creature looked like the definition of independence gone wrong. Feral maybe, probably flea-ridden. A complication he absolutely did not need. He should close the door. Let nature take its course. It wasn't his responsibility. But those eyes, that intense, unwavering green gaze, it held something beyond fear, a profound stillness, a quiet dignity in the midst of utter misery. It mirrored the stillness he felt inside himself, the quiet desperation. He saw the tremor running through her, the way her wet fur clung to fragile bones. He saw the notch in her ear, a silent story of hardship. He saw vulnerability, stark and undeniable. He didn't think. He just moved. Slowly, so slowly, he reached back towards the counter where a slightly stale piece of bread sat on a plate. He broke off a small corner, leaned forward just enough to place it on the damp concrete step, well away from the threshold, and then retreated quickly back into the kitchen. He didn't close the door. He left it open that crucial inch, letting the light spill out onto the step. He backed away, sinking onto the cold linoleum floor, his back against the lower cabinets. He watched. The cat didn't move for a long moment. Her gaze flickered between him and the scrap of bread. The rain drummed on the roof, a relentless percussion. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, she inched forward. Her movements were stiff, cautious. She sniffed the bread, then looked up at him again, those green eyes searching his face. Daniel held his breath. He felt a ridiculous pang of hope, absurd in the face of a starving stray and a piece of stale bread. Then, with a speed that startled him, she snatched the bread in her mouth and darted back into the shadows beside the step. She didn't run away. She huddled there, sheltered by the doorframe, and devoured the meager offering in 3 quick bites. She licked the damp concrete where the bread had been, then looked back at Daniel. Not at his face this time. At the open door. At the slice of warmth and light spilling out onto the wet step. Daniel didn't move. He sat on the cold floor, the silence inside the house momentarily forgotten, replaced by the rhythmic drumming of rain and the quiet, desperate presence just outside the door. The green eyes held his, no longer just wary. There was a question in them now. A fragile, impossible hope. He looked at the shivering cat, this small, scarred, rain-soaked creature seeking refuge. He looked at the boxes, the relics of a life ended. He felt the crushing weight of his own loneliness pressing down. The cold from the open door seeped into his bones, but it was different now. It was the cold of the outside world, a world this creature was braving, and he was merely observing from his fortress of grief. He didn't speak. He didn't reach out. He just stayed, sitting on the kitchen floor, the door open a crack, the rain falling, the small tortoiseshell cat watching him from the edge of the storm. In that suspended moment, the crushing silence inside the house seemed to shift, just slightly. It wasn't filled, but it was no longer entirely empty. There was a presence, a fragile, shared vulnerability on the threshold. Something quiet, almost imperceptible, had stirred in the stagnant air and in Daniel's numb heart. The world hadn't gotten bigger, but it had just gotten a little less lonely. For both of them, the beginning wasn't grand, it was damp and small, and trembling on a concrete step. But it was a beginning. Daniel didn't close the door that night. He sat on the cold linoleum, back against the cabinets, watching the ragged silhouette huddled just beyond the slice of light. The rain lessened to a persistent drizzle, dripping from the overflowing gutters with a rhythmic plink, plink, plink onto the concrete step. The cat, a shadow within the shadow, remained. Curled tight, a damp, trembling comma against the worn wood of the doorframe. Her intense green eyes, when they occasionally flickered open to check on him, seemed to absorb the weak kitchen light, holding it like embers. Sleep was impossible. The silence of the house, usually so oppressive, now felt charged, expectant. Every rustle of wet leaves against the window, every creak of the old timbers settling, made Daniel start, his gaze darting back to the open crack of the door. Was she still there? Had she vanished back into the rainy dark? He'd inch forward, peering out, and there she'd be. A small, dark shape breathing shallowly. A presence. An anchor in his sea of grief. He found an old, chipped cereal bowl in a box marked Kitchen Miscellaneous. He filled it with water, placing it carefully just outside the door, further out than the bread had been. Retreating quickly. He watched, heart thudding strangely loud in the quiet, as she uncurled, stretched stiffly, and crept forward. Not looking at him. Fixated on the water. She drank, long, deep laps, her small throat working. The sound was loud in the stillness, a desperate, grateful gulping. When she finished, she retreated again, but not as far. Closer to the threshold. She licked her muddy paws, a slow, meticulous ritual. Then she sat, watching him, not demanding, just existing, together in the shared space of the open door. Morning came gray and damp, the world washed clean but still heavy. Daniel woke stiff and cold on the kitchen floor, the door still ajar. Panic flared. Had she gone? But there she was, curled in the exact spot, drier now, her tortoiseshell fur a patchwork of damp browns, blacks, and oranges starting to fluff slightly. Her eyes opened as he stirred, that unwavering green gaze. Assessing. He moved slowly, deliberately. Making coffee. The familiar ritual felt different. He was aware of being watched. He poured the hot water over the grounds, the rich, bitter aroma filling the small kitchen, mingling with the lingering scent of damp earth and wet fur drifting in from the step. He toasted bread, the smell of warm carbohydrates pulling at something primal. He deliberately dropped a small, plain corner onto the step, near the water bowl. He didn't watch her take it this time. He busied himself wiping the counter, giving her the illusion of privacy. The tiny snap of her taking the bread, the soft crunching, were sounds that somehow filled the hollow corners of the room. This became the rhythm. Daniel, moving through the fog of grief, performing the necessary acts of living. Heating soup he barely tasted, attempting to open a box labeled Dad's Study Books, staring blankly at the water stain on the ceiling. And the cat, a silent, watchful counterpoint. She remained on the step, or just outside the door in the overgrown yard, never crossing the threshold. But her presence became a constant. Daniel started calling her Fudge, a quiet murmur to himself, acknowledging the small scar on her ear. A mark of survival. He bought a small bag of dry cat food from the corner store. The act felt significant, an admission. He placed a small pile on a piece of clean cardboard just outside the door. Notch watched him do it, her head tilted slightly. She didn't approach immediately. It took hours. But eventually, hunger overcoming caution, she crept forward and ate. Delicately at first, then with more confidence. Daniel watched from the kitchen window, the glass cool against his forehead. Seeing her eat something meant for her, something he provided, stirred a warmth in his chest he hadn't felt in months. Fleeting, but real. He started talking to her. Softly. Nonsense mostly. Comments about the weather, the stubbornness of the ancient furnace, the confusing tangle of paperwork for the house. Rain's coming back, Notch, he'd murmur, watching the gray clouds gather. Or, think this box is full of tax returns from the 90s, thrilling stuff. His voice, rusty from disuse, felt strange in his own ears. But she'd listen. Her ears would twitch towards the sound. Sometimes she'd blink slowly, those luminous green eyes closing and opening with deliberate calm. Daniel read about that online one restless night, the slow blink. A cat's sign of trust, of comfort. It felt like a gift, a tiny, silent acknowledgement. He learned her routines. She'd appear like a shadow at dawn, waiting near the step. She'd disappear for hours during the day, likely hunting in the tangled wilderness of the yard or neighboring lots. But she'd return in the late afternoon, settling in her spot as dusk painted the sky in bruised purples and oranges. Her presence became a punctuation mark in his shapeless days. A reason to get up, to put food out, to open the door just that inch. One drizzly afternoon, Daniel finally tackled the box labeled Dad Sweaters. The smell hit him first, a wave of pipe tobacco, Old Spice, and something indefinably him. It stole Daniel's breath. He pulled out a thick cable-knit gray sweater, one his father had worn constantly in winter. He buried his face in it, the wool scratchy against his cheek, inhaling the fading scent. Tears, hot and sudden, welled up. The grief, a physical pressure in his chest, was overwhelming. He sank to the floor of the cluttered living room, the sweater clutched to him, silent sobs shaking his shoulders. The loneliness, the guilt, the sheer aching missing him, it was a tidal wave crashing over him. He felt utterly, devastatingly alone. He didn't hear her approach. Not a sound. But suddenly, there was a shift in the air near the open kitchen door. He looked up, his vision blurred, his face wet. Notch was there. Not on the step. She had crossed the threshold. She stood just inside the kitchen, on the worn linoleum, utterly still. Her green eyes were fixed on him, wide, watchful. Not afraid. Intensely focused. She took one cautious step forward, then another. Her tail was low, not tucked, but held with a quiet gravity. She stopped about 5 feet away from where he sat crumpled on the living room rug. Daniel held his breath, the sweater still pressed to his chest. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched her, this small, wild creature who had witnessed his breaking point. Slowly, deliberately, Notch lowered herself, not into a full curl, but into a crouch. A sphinx-like pose, forepaws stretched out slightly. Her gaze never left his face. She didn't purr, didn't meow. She simply held space. Her stillness was profound. It wasn't indifference. It was a different kind of presence. Solid, unwavering, a silent vigil. Minutes stretched. Daniel's ragged breathing slowly evened out. The crushing wave of grief receded, leaving him hollow, exhausted, but strangely not entirely alone anymore. The silence wasn't empty. It was shared, filled by the soft, rhythmic sound of Notch breathing, by the intensity of her green eyes watching him, by the simple, grounding fact of her being there. Inside the house, choosing to stay near him in his rawest moment. Later, when he finally stirred, stiff and drained, he moved slowly towards the kitchen to refill her water bowl. Notch didn't flee. She watched him, then stood, stretched, and retreated gracefully back to her spot just outside the door. But something had shifted. The invisible line had been crossed. Not physically, she still preferred the threshold, but emotionally. A connection, fragile as a spider's web, had been spun in the space between his tears and her unwavering gaze. Days turned into a week. The tentative dance continued. Notch allowed Daniel closer. He could sit on the top step now, a mug of coffee steaming in the crisp autumn air, while she ate the food he provided. He learned the texture of her fur, not by touch, but by observation. The way the sunlight caught the burnt orange patches, making them glow like embers. The soft fluff of her belly fur, lighter than the rest. The way the fur around her scarred ear grew in slightly different directions. He noticed how meticulously she cleaned herself, the rasp of her tongue audible from his perch. He saw the faint, healed scratches on her nose, the slightly crooked tip of her tail, signs of a life lived hard before finding his step. He started to see her, not just a stray cat, but a creature of habit, cautious but curious, independent but present. She had a particular way of tilting her head when she heard a bird in the overgrown rose bushes. A soft, chirping sound she'd make in her throat when she saw him approach with the food bowl. A stubborn refusal to touch the food if he lingered too close initially, demanding her space. And Daniel, he found himself talking more. Not just about the mundane, but about his dad. Haltingly at first, then with a strange, cathartic flow. He loved these awful jazz records, Notch, he'd say, sitting on the step, looking at the neglected turntable in the living room. Drove Mom crazy. Said it sounded like cats fighting in an alley. He'd smile faintly, the first real smile in months. He was stubborn, like someone else I know. He'd glance at her, and sometimes she'd slow blink back. A shared secret. He told her about the argument, the last one. The harsh words about his graphic design dreams, his dad's disappointment that he wasn't taking over the hardware store, the slammed door as Daniel left for the city. "I never called back," Daniel whispered one evening, the air turning sharp with the promise of frost. "I was so angry." And then, his throat closed. He stared at the darkening yard, the silhouette of Notch sitting nearby, a silent, listening shadow. "I thought there'd be time. To apologize. To make him understand." The familiar guilt, cold and heavy, settled in his gut. Notch didn't offer solutions. She didn't nuzzle him or purr sympathetically. She just listened. Her presence was a container for his unspoken pain. Her steady breathing, the occasional soft MRP sound, the way she'd occasionally look up at him, those green eyes holding a depth that felt ancient and understanding, it was a different kind of comfort. It wasn't fixing anything. It was simply being with, acknowledging the ache without trying to plaster over it. One cold evening, Daniel brought out an old, worn blanket. He spread it on the dry patch of concrete just inside the open door. An invitation. Notch watched him do it, her head cocked. She sniffed the blanket cautiously when he stepped away. Later, when Daniel sat reading a book in the armchair near the kitchen doorway, a feeble attempt at normalcy, he saw her approach the blanket. She circled it, once, twice, kneading it tentatively with her front paws. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from her very bones, she settled onto it, curling into a tight, compact ball. Her green eyes closed. She was asleep. On the blanket. Inside the house. Just over the threshold. Daniel watched her sleeping form, the gentle rise and fall of her sides, the way her ears twitched faintly at some dream sound. The radiator clanked softly, the wind sighed around the eaves. The house, still filled with his father's absence, still packed with the physical weight of memory, felt different. Warmer, softer at the edges. The silence wasn't gone, but it was woven through now with the soft rhythm of Notch's breathing, a tiny, living heartbeat against the vastness of his loss. He leaned his head back against the chair, the book forgotten in his lap. He felt not happy, not healed, but tethered, less adrift. The connection, built crumb by crumb, blink by slow blink, was becoming something real, something vital. He hadn't saved her, not really. She was still wild, still independent. But she had chosen to stay, to share his threshold, to listen to his fractured heart. He closed his eyes, listening to the quiet symphony of the old house and the sleeping cat. He felt the familiar ache of grief, but beneath it, like the first fragile green shoots pushing through frost-hardened earth, was something else. A fragile, tentative sense of not being entirely alone. The warmth of the blanket, the warmth of her small body trusting enough to sleep just inside his world. It seeped into him. Quietly, steadily, a small, purring ember of hope flickering in the vast, cold silence. The blanket became Notch's domain. A small, worn island of safety just inside the kitchen door. Daniel started leaving it there permanently, rolling it up during the day only to unfurl it again each evening as dusk painted the sky. It was a ritual, a silent promise. He'd place her food bowl near it, refill the water. She'd arrive, sometimes silently, sometimes with a soft, questioning "Arapi?" from the shadows of the yard, and settle onto her blanket. She'd eat, clean herself with that meticulous, rasping tongue, and then curl up, often watching Daniel as he moved about the kitchen, making his own solitary dinner, washing dishes, staring blankly at the mountain of boxes. The house felt different with her presence, even confined to that small square of fabric. The silence wasn't shattered, but it was textured now. By the soft sigh of her breathing as she slept. By the tiny click of her claws on the linoleum if she shifted position. By the occasional contented rumble, not quite a full purr, but a vibration deep in her chest that Daniel felt more than heard, a sound that seemed to resonate in the hollow spaces within him. He found himself talking to her more openly, voicing the tangled mess of grief and guilt that still knotted his insides. "He kept everything, Notch," he murmured one night, leaning against the counter, staring at a box labeled miscellaneous, receipts from 1983. Broken toasters. But what was he holding on to? Notch just blinked slowly from her blanket, her green eyes luminous pools in the dim light, offering no answers, only unwavering presence. He started venturing further into the house, spurred by a strange mixture of her quiet companionship and a growing, restless energy. He tackled the living room boxes, unearthing photo albums heavy with dust. Pictures of his dad, younger, grinning beside a gleaming, ancient car Daniel barely remembered. Pictures of his mom, her smile bright, years before the cancer took her when Daniel was 12. Pictures of himself, gap-toothed, held aloft on his dad's shoulders. Each image was a punch, a reminder of time lost, of words unspoken, of the sheer, final absence. He'd sit on the floor amidst the chaos, an album open on his lap, tears silently tracking down his face. And Notch, she'd watch. From her blanket, her head lifted, those green eyes fixed on him, radiating a quiet understanding that felt deeper than any human comfort could offer. She never approached during these moments, respecting the invisible boundary of his grief, but her vigil was constant. A sentinel. Then, the change began. Subtle at first, easy to dismiss. It started with the basement door. The door was tucked under the stairs, old, scarred wood painted a faded, institutional green. It led down to the unfinished basement, a place of concrete walls, exposed pipes, the groaning furnace, and decades of accumulated clutter Daniel hadn't dared to face. His father had collapsed down there, clutching his chest, managing only to crawl halfway up the stairs before. Daniel hadn't been down there since identifying the body. The door remained shut, a physical barrier guarding a chamber of pure pain. One evening, as Daniel walked past it towards the kitchen, carrying a mug of tea, Notch, who had been dozing on her blanket, suddenly sat bolt upright. Her ears flattened against her skull. Not fearfully, but with intense focus. Her body went rigid, tail low and still. A low sound, not quite a growl, more like a deep, resonant hum vibrated in her throat. Her intense green eyes were fixed, laser-lit on the basement door. Daniel stopped. "Notch," he said softly. "What is it?" She didn't look at him. Her gaze remained locked on the door. The humming sound continued, a steady, unsettling thrum. Her hackles, the fur along her spine, lifted slightly. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then, as abruptly as it started, she relaxed. Her ears swiveled forward. She gave herself a quick shake, glanced at Daniel, and settled back onto her blanket, curling up as if nothing had happened. Daniel stared at the basement door. It looked the same. Solid. Implacable. He felt a cold prickle run down his spine. Was it a mouse? Rats? The old furnace making a strange noise? He strained his ears, but heard only the familiar creaks and sighs of the old house. He shook his head. "Just the house settling, girl," he murmured, more to reassure himself than her. But the image of her rigid posture, that low, focused hum, stayed with him. Unsettling. The behavior repeated. Not every day, but often enough to become a pattern. Sometimes when Daniel passed the door. Sometimes when he was sitting quietly in the living room. Notch would suddenly tense, stare fixedly at the green door, emit that low, resonant hum, her body vibrating with an alertness that felt protective? Warning? Daniel couldn't decipher it. He tried tapping the door, listening intently. Nothing. He shone a flashlight under the gap at the bottom. Dust bunnies. Phobos. No signs of rodents. He even, one afternoon when he felt a surge of misplaced courage, gripped the cold brass knob, turned it slowly, felt the latch click open. He pulled the door open just a crack, enough to smell the damp, cool, slightly metallic air of the basement, the scent of concrete and dust, and something else faint, something vaguely medicinal or chemical that triggered a wave of nausea. He slammed it shut immediately, his heart hammering against his ribs. Notch, watching from her blanket, had let out a sharp yowl the moment the door opened, a sound of pure distress he'd never heard from her before. Okay, Daniel breathed, leaning his forehead against the cool wood of the door, trying to calm his racing pulse. "I get it. You don't like it. Message received." He looked at Notch. She was still staring at the door, her tail twitching violently, the low hum back in her throat. It wasn't just dislike. It was something deeper, something visceral. The avoidance of the basement door became a shared, unspoken rule. Daniel stopped going near it unnecessarily. The very sight of it now carried a weight, amplified by Notch's inexplicable reaction. It became a symbol not just of his father's death, but of the unknown, the unresolved, the terrifyingly final. Then, another layer appeared. The scratching. It started one night. A soft, persistent sound. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Not near the front door where she might want in or out. Not at the back door she used. This sound came from the hallway wall, the wall adjacent to the basement stairs. Daniel, reading in the armchair near Notch's blanket, looked up. Notch was standing, not by the wall, but a few feet away in the hallway. Her body was angled towards the sound, her ears pricked forward. But she wasn't making it. She was listening to it. Daniel got up, his book forgotten. Notch? What is that? The scratching continued. Soft, rhythmic, almost tentative. It sounded like it was coming from inside the wall. He pressed his ear against the faded floral wallpaper. Slightly dusty. He could hear the scratching more clearly, a dry, scraping sound. Rats? In the walls? It seemed the most logical explanation, yet, why was Notch just listening? Why wasn't she stalking? Pouncing? Showing any sign of feline predatory instinct? She stood utterly still, head tilted, a look of intense recognition on her small face. He grabbed a flashlight. The scratching stopped instantly. Silence. He tapped the wall. Nothing. He shone the light along the baseboard, looking for holes. Nothing obvious. Just old, slightly crumbling plaster. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Old house, he muttered to Notch. Full of noises. She blinked slowly at him, then turned and padded back to her blanket, curling up as if the incident was closed. But Daniel felt a seed of unease take root. Logic said rodents. His gut, and Notch's strange behavior, whispered something else. Something he couldn't name. The scratching became a nocturnal visitor. Always soft. Always stopping the moment Daniel investigated. Always seeming to originate near that basement wall. And Notch, she always reacted. Not with fear, but with that same intense focus. That stillness, sometimes accompanied by the low hum. She'd often sit near the spot, staring at the wall, long after the scratching ceased. As if waiting, or listening for something only she could perceive. The door was tucked under the stairs, old, scarred, with painted a faded, institutional green. It led down to the unfinished basement, a place of concrete walls, exposed pipes, the groaning furnace, and decades of accumulated clutter Daniel hadn't dared to face. His father had collapsed down there, clutching his chest, managing only to crawl halfway up the stairs before. Daniel hadn't been down there since identifying the body. The door remained shut, a physical barrier guarding a chamber of pure pain. One evening, as Daniel walked past it towards the kitchen, carrying a mug of tea, Notch, who had been dozing on her blanket, suddenly sat bolt upright. Her ears flattened against her skull. Not fearfully, but with intense focus. Her body went rigid, tail low and still. A low sound, not quite a growl, more like a deep, resonant hum vibrated in her throat. Her intense green eyes were fixed, laser-lit on the basement door. Daniel stopped. "Notch?" he said softly. "What is it?" She didn't look at him. Her gaze remained locked on the door. The humming sound continued, a steady, unsettling thrum. Her hackles, the fur along her spine, lifted slightly. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then, as abruptly as it started, she relaxed. Her ears swiveled forward. She gave herself a quick shake, glanced at Daniel, and settled back onto her blanket, curling up as if nothing had happened. Daniel stared at the basement door. It looked the same. Solid. Implacable. He felt a cold prickle run down his spine. Was it a mouse? Rats? The old furnace making a strange noise? He strained his ears, but heard only the familiar creaks and sighs of the old house. He shook his head. "Just the house settling, girl," he murmured, more to reassure himself than her. But the image of her rigid posture, that low, focused hum, stayed with him. Unsettling. The behavior repeated. Not every day, but often enough to become a pattern. Sometimes when Daniel passed the door. Sometimes when he was sitting quietly in the living room. Notch would suddenly tense, stare fixedly at the green door, that low, resonant hum, her body vibrating with an alertness that felt protective? Warning? Daniel couldn't decipher it. He tried tapping the door, listening intently. Nothing. He shone a flashlight under the gap at the bottom. Dust bunnies. Cubs. No signs of rodents. He even, one afternoon when he felt a surge of misplaced courage, gripped the cold brass knob, turned it slowly, felt the latch click open. He pulled the door open just a crack, enough to smell the damp, cool, slightly metallic air of the basement, the scent of concrete and dust, and something else faint, something vaguely medicinal or chemical that triggered a wave of nausea. He slammed it shut immediately, his heart hammering against his ribs. Notch, watching from her blanket, had let out a sharp yowl the moment the door opened, a sound of pure distress he'd never heard from her before. Okay, Daniel breathed, leaning his forehead against the cool wood of the door, trying to calm his racing pulse. "I get it. You don't like it. Message received." He looked at Notch. She was still staring at the door, her tail twitching violently, the low hum back in her throat. It wasn't just dislike. It was something deeper, something visceral. The avoidance of the basement door became a shared, unspoken rule. Daniel stopped going near it unnecessarily. The very sight of it now carried a weight, amplified by Notch's inexplicable reaction. It became a symbol not just of his father's death, but of the unknown, the unresolved, the terrifyingly final. Then another layer appeared. The scratching. It started one night. A soft, persistent sound. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Not near the front door where she might want in or out. Not at the back door she used. This sound came from the hallway wall, the wall adjacent to the basement stairs. Daniel, reading in the armchair near Notch's blanket, looked up. Notch was standing, not by the wall, but a few feet away in the hallway. Her body was angled towards the sound, her ears pricked forward. But she wasn't making it. She was listening to it. Daniel got up, his book forgotten. "Notch? What is that?" The scratching continued. Soft, rhythmic, almost tentative. It sounded like it was coming from inside the wall. He pressed his ear against the faded floral wallpaper. Slightly dusty. He could hear the scratching more clearly, a dry, scraping sound. Rats? In the walls? It seemed the most logical explanation, yet, why was Notch just listening? Why wasn't she stalking? Pouncing? Showing any sign of feline predatory instinct? She stood utterly still, head tilted, a look of intense recognition on her small face. He grabbed a flashlight. The scratching stopped instantly. Silence. He tapped the wall. Nothing. He shone the light along the baseboard, looking for holes. Nothing obvious. Just old, slightly crumbling plaster. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Old house," he muttered to Notch. "Full of noises." She blinked slowly at him, then turned and padded back to her blanket, curling up as if the incident was closed. But Daniel felt a seed of unease take root. Logic said rodents. His gut and Notch's strange behavior whispered something else. Something he couldn't name. The scratching became a nocturnal visitor. Always soft. Always stopping the moment Daniel investigated. Always seeming to originate near that basement wall. And Notch, she always reacted. Not with fear, but with that same intense focus. That stillness, sometimes accompanied by the low hum. She'd often sit near the spot, staring at the wall, long after the scratching ceased, as if waiting, or listening for something only she could perceive. The slammed door echoed in the hallway, a final, hollow punctuation mark to Daniel's outburst. The frantic scratching had ceased, replaced by a silence thick as cotton wool pressing in on his ears. He sat slumped against the locked basement door, knees drawn up, forehead pressed against the cool, faded green paint that smelled faintly of dust and old regret. His hands still trembled. Adrenaline, cold and sour, pulsed through him. The image of the dark stairs, the spot halfway up, the remembered scent of despair and something chemical, it clung to him, cloying and terrifying. Notch sat a few feet away, utterly still. Her earlier agitation had vanished. The low hum was gone. She simply watched him, those intense green eyes luminous in the dim hallway light, unblinking. Her stillness wasn't passive. It felt like a presence, an anchor thrown into his storm of fear and guilt. She wasn't demanding anything, just being there, witnessing his unraveling. Minutes stretched. The old house groaned and settled around them, familiar sounds now rendered ominous by the locked door at Daniel's back. He closed his eyes, trying to breathe through the tightness in his chest. He saw his father's face, the stubborn set of his jaw during their last argument, the unexpected vulnerability that sometimes flickered in his eyes when he thought Daniel wasn't looking. He saw the paramedics' impersonal efficiency, the stark white sheet, the suffocating silence that followed. The guilt, a cold, heavy stone, settled deeper. I should have been here. I should have called. I should have. A soft sound broke through the suffocating silence. Not the scratching. Not a growl. A gentle, persistent tap tap tap. Daniel flinched, eyes snapping open. It wasn't coming from the basement door. It was coming from the hallway wall beside him, the wall adjacent to the stairs. The scratching wall. He turned his head slowly, dreading what he'd see. Notch wasn't looking at the wall. She was looking at him. And she was tapping. Gently, deliberately, with one small, white-tipped paw against the faded floral wallpaper. Tap, tap, tap. Then she paused, her green eyes holding his, unwavering. She did it again. Tap, tap, tap. Not frantic. Not angry. Insistent. Purposeful. As if she were trying to show him something. Trying to communicate. Daniel stared, the cold fear momentarily eclipsed by sheer bewilderment. "What?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "What are you doing, Notch?" She tapped again. Tap, tap, tap. Then she lowered her head, sniffed intently at a specific spot on the baseboard, right where the wallpaper met the worn wooden trim. She looked back at him, tapped the spot with her paw, then looked pointedly at the wall, then back at him. Her message was clear. "Look here." The absurdity warred with the desperate need for answers. The locked door behind him felt like a physical weight, a monument to his cowardice. But this small cat, this creature who had crossed his threshold, who had witnessed his grief, who reacted with such profound unease to the basement, she wasn't reacting to the locked door. She was focused on the wall, on this specific spot. Her insistence, her strange, focused tapping, it cut through the paralysis. It wasn't logic. It was pure, visceral trust in her perception. "Okay," Daniel breathed, the word barely audible. "Okay, girl. Show me." He pushed himself up off the floor, his legs stiff and shaky. He knelt beside Notch. She immediately stepped back, giving him space, but her eyes remained fixed on the spot she'd indicated. Daniel ran his fingers over the wallpaper. It felt cool, slightly rough, patterned with faded pink roses and green leaves. He pressed. It felt solid. He traced the baseboard trim. Old oak, scarred and dusty. Nothing seemed unusual. He remembered the frantic scratching, the sound seeming to come from inside the wall. He recalled the strange, medicinal scent that sometimes drifted from the basement, the one that triggered his nausea. A thought, cold and unwelcome, slithered into his mind. His father had been taking medication for his heart. Nitroglycerin? Had he dropped a bottle? Was it hidden, lost, behind this wall? Was that the source of the smell? The thing Notch sensed? He pressed his ear against the wallpaper where Notch had tapped. Silence. Just the muffled thud of his own pulse. He tapped the wall lightly with his knuckles. A dull thud. Solid. He moved his hand lower, towards the baseboard, tapping along the trim. Thud, 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 thud. Then, just above the spot Notch had sniffed, thunk. It sounded different. Slightly hollow. Daniel's breath hitched. He tapped again. Thunk. Definitely different. He examined the baseboard trim closely, running his fingers along its edge. It seemed firmly attached. He pressed, pushed, nothing. He felt along the top edge where it met the wallpaper, his fingers encountering decades of accumulated dust, and then a tiny, almost imperceptible gap. Not where the trim met the wall, but where two pieces of the trim itself met, near the corner. It was a joint, cleverly fitted, but perhaps loosened by time and the vibrations of the old house. He dug his fingernails into the minute gap. It resisted. He pushed harder, wiggled, felt a tiny give. A splinter jabbed under his nail, sharp pain, but he ignored it. He pushed, pried, felt the ancient wood groan. With a small, reluctant pop, a section of the baseboard trim, about a foot long, pulled away from the wall. Behind it wasn't plaster. It was darkness. A narrow, vertical cavity, maybe an old chase for pipes long removed, or simply a flaw in the construction, hidden by the trim. Dust motes danced in the weak hallway light as Daniel peered into the narrow space. It smelled of dry wood, ancient dust, and, faintly, that same, sharp, medicinal scent. His heart hammered. He reached in tentatively, his fingers brushing against something thought wood. Something smooth. Cylindrical. He grasped it, pulled it out. It was a small, amber-colored prescription bottle. The label was faded, peeling, but legible. His father's name. The medication, nitroglycerin. For angina. Heart pain. The date was... Daniel's breath caught, 3 months before he died. The bottle was nearly full. He stared at it, the small plastic container feeling heavy as lead in his palm. The implications crashed over him. His father hadn't been taking his medication. He'd hidden it, stashed it away, behind the wall, near the basement stairs. Denial? Stubbornness? Fear of admitting weakness? The same stubbornness that refused to accept Daniel's career choice. The same fear of vulnerability that fueled their last argument. The locked basement door, the hidden pills, the frantic scratching that wasn't rodents. Notch's focused vigilance. It all coalesced into a devastating clarity. The scratching, Daniel suddenly understood. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was memory. His subconscious terror, his unresolved guilt clawing at the walls of his mind, amplified, reflected, sensed by this small, impossibly perceptive creature who had entered his life. Notch hadn't been reacting to a physical presence in the wall, but to the echo of his father's final moments, to the lingering scent of fear and medication, to the overwhelming emotional resonance of that spot, a resonance Daniel had been too afraid to face. She'd been trying to point him towards the truth he was hiding from, not a physical object, but the bottle was a symbol, a tangible manifestation of the denial and fear that had ultimately cost his father his life and cost Daniel his chance at reconciliation. The grief, when it hit, wasn't a wave. It was a dam breaking, a torrential flood that swept away the numbness, the anger, the brittle shell he'd built around his pain. He didn't sob. He crumpled, folded in on himself there on the dusty hallway floor, the small amber bottle clutched in his hand, the open cavity in the wall gaping beside him like a wound. A raw, guttural sound tore from his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated anguish. Tears, hot and endless, streamed down his face, dripping onto the worn linoleum. It was grief for his father, for the pain he must have been in, for the pride that kept him silent. It was grief for himself, for the lost years, the harsh words, the apology that would forever go unheard. It was grief for the terrifying finality of it all. The locked door in his mind, the one guarding the raw truth of his father's suffering and his own culpability in their estrangement, was blown wide open. He cried until his ribs ached, until his throat was raw, until the hallway lights seemed to blur and swim. The world narrowed to the taste of salt, the smell of dust and tears, and that faint, haunting medicinal scent, the feel of the cool plastic bottle digging into his palm, and the crushing weight of understanding. Then a warmth. So insistent. He felt it against his leg. Through the haze of tears, he looked down. Notch. She had moved. Not just closer. She had climbed onto his lap. She wasn't purring. She wasn't rubbing. She simply settled herself, a small, compact weight, right over his pounding heart. She laid her head down, resting her chin gently on his forearm that clutched the bottle. Her green eyes, luminous and deep, looked up at him. Not with pity, not with judgment, with an infinite, profound knowing. She closed her eyes, a slow, deliberate blink, and then kept them closed, resting, anchoring him. Her warmth seeped through his jeans, a small, living counterpoint to the icy despair threatening to consume him. Her steady breathing, the faint rise and fall of her side against his chest, became a rhythm, a lifeline. Daniel stared at her, this small, scarred tortoiseshell cat, this stray who had sought shelter from the storm. She hadn't saved him from a physical threat. She had led him, relentlessly, compassionately, to face the monster within his own heart, to unlock the door he'd barricaded with guilt and fear. She had shown him the hidden pain, not to destroy him, but to release it. Her presence on his lap, her quiet, grounding warmth, was an act of pure, unspoken love, an acceptance of his brokenness, a silent promise that he wasn't alone in the wreckage. He lowered his head, resting his cheek against the soft fur between her ears. He inhaled her scent, dust, sunshine, and something uniquely her, wild and comforting. He felt the vibration start deep within her chest. Not loud, not demanding. A soft, resonant rumble. A purr that seemed to resonate through his own bones. A gentle, persistent thrumming against the storm of his grief. He didn't move for a long time. He sat on the floor, the hidden cavity open beside him, the amber bottle still clutched in his hand, the locked basement door at his back, and the small cat purring softly on his lap. The tears still fell, but they were different now. Cleaner. Less desperate. They were tears of release, of sorrow finally acknowledged, of a love that existed beyond arguments and silence and death. The crushing weight hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. It was no longer a suffocating pressure, but a heavy cloak he could begin, slowly, to learn to carry. He looked down at Notch, at the peaceful curve of her body, the way her paws tucked neatly under her. He saw the notch in her ear, a mark of her own survival. He saw the faint scratches on her nose, the crooked tail. He saw the fierce, quiet loyalty that had guided him through his darkest moment. In her stillness, her warmth, her unwavering presence, he saw a reflection of the love his father had shown, in his own gruff, stubborn way. The love that had kept every receipt, every broken toaster, every picture. The love that had wanted his son close, even if he expressed it terribly. Daniel carefully, reverently, placed the small amber bottle on the floor beside him. He didn't need to hold onto the symbol of pain anymore. He wrapped both arms gently around Notch, not squeezing, just holding, feeling the vibration of her purr against his chest, a soothing counter-rhythm to his own slowing heartbeat. He closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of her fur, the dust of the house, the fading trace of medication, and beneath it all, the fragile, undeniable scent of hope. The locked basement door still stood. The grief still ached. But the silence, the crushing, empty silence that had filled the house for months, was truly gone, replaced by the soft, resonant purr of a small cat and the quiet, healing breaths of a man finally beginning to face the light. The breaking point had passed, shattered, but in the shards, glinting amidst the dust and tears, was the possibility of putting something new, something whole, back together. Starting with the small, warm creature who had never given up on him, who had, in her own silent, profound way, saved him. The purr was a lifeline. Daniel clung to it, the soft, resonant vibration thrumming through Notch's small body and into his own, a steady anchor in the turbulent sea of his release. He sat on the dusty hallway floor for a long time, long after the tears subsided into shaky breaths, long after the weak light filtering through the window shifted towards the deep indigo of twilight. He didn't move. Notch didn't move. They existed in a fragile, shared stillness, the open cavity in the wall breathing dust beside them, the small amber bottle a silent sentinel on the linoleum, the locked basement door a looming presence at his back. The crushing weight hadn't vanished, but it had transformed. It was no longer an impenetrable fog of guilt and terror, but a heavy, acknowledged burden. The truth, stark and painful, was out. His father's hidden pain, his own crippling avoidance, the tragic, irreversible consequences of both. The grief felt cleaner now, sharper, but also, strangely more manageable. It wasn't a monster hiding in the dark, it was a wound, deep and raw, but finally exposed to the air, beginning the long, slow process of healing. Eventually, stiffly, Daniel shifted. Notch lifted her head, her green eyes blinking slowly open, watching him with that quiet, unwavering focus. He carefully gathered her small body warm and surprisingly solid, and stood up. His legs protested, pins and needles singing. He carried her back to her worn blanket just inside the kitchen door, placing her gently down. She immediately curled into a tight ball, tucking her nose under her tail, watching him. He looked at the hallway, at the gaping hole in the wall, at the bottle, at the green door. The silence was different now. Not empty, but contemplative, heavy with understanding. He picked up the amber bottle. The plastic felt cool, impersonal. He didn't throw it away. Not yet. He placed it on the scarred kitchen table, a tangible reminder, a totem of the truth he couldn't hide from anymore. The next morning dawned gray and still. Daniel woke on the lumpy sofa, where he'd eventually retreated. Notch, a warm weight curled against his side. She'd never slept on the furniture before. Her presence there, a deliberate choice, felt significant. He lay still for a moment, listening to her soft breathing, feeling the familiar ache in his chest, but noticing, too, a new sensation. A quiet emptiness of dread. The terror associated with the basement, while not gone, had lost its sharp, paralyzing edge. It was replaced by a profound sadness and a dawning sense of responsibility. He made coffee. The ritual felt grounding. He placed Notch's food bowl near her blanket, but she didn't rush to it immediately. She stretched, long and luxurious, her claws scraping softly on the blanket, then padded into the kitchen. She sat near his feet, looking up at him as if waiting. He poured dry food into her bowl. She ate, but not with her usual focused intensity. She took a few bites, then looked back at him, her tail flicking gently. It felt companionable. He looked at the basement door key, still in the lock. He walked over, slowly, deliberately. He touched the cold brass. The fear was a low hum, but it didn't scream. Notch followed him, sitting a respectful distance away, watching. Not tense, not humming, just present. Her calmness was a balm. Daniel turned the key. The lock clicked open, a sound that echoed loudly in the quiet house. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of coffee, and the faint, lingering trace of that medicinal smell from beyond the door. He grasped the knob. It felt cold, heavy. He pulled the door open. The damp, cool air rushed out, carrying the familiar sense of concrete, mildew, and that sharper, chemical undertone. Weaker now, less nauseating, sad. The weak bulb illuminated the steep wooden stairs, descending into gloom. Daniel flicked the switch for the main basement light, a single, dusty fixture hanging from the rafters. It cast a wan, yellowish glow, revealing the cluttered space below, stacks of boxes, old furniture draped in sheets, the hulking shape of the furnace, exposed pipes snaking along the concrete walls. He didn't descend. Not yet. He stood at the threshold, looking down. He saw the spot, halfway up the stairs, where his father had fallen. He could almost see him, crumpled, hand clutching his chest. The grief surged, hot and sharp, but it didn't paralyze him. He let it come. He acknowledged it. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry I wasn't here. I'm sorry I didn't call." The words, silent, spoken only in his heart, felt necessary. A start. He closed the door. Not locked it, just closed it. The act felt symbolic. Not barricading the pain, but simply closing a door. For now. He turned around. Notch was still sitting there, watching him. He crouched down, held out his hand, palm down. Not demanding touch, just offering. Notch looked at his hand, then slowly, deliberately stretched her neck forward and bumped the top of her head against his knuckles. A brief, dry touch. Then she turned and padded back towards her blanket. It wasn't affection exactly. It was acknowledgement, a shared understanding. "I see you." We faced it. Life began to move differently. The rhythm changed. Daniel still woke to gray mornings, still felt the ache of absence, but the oppressive weight of unprocessed grief had lifted. He started tackling the boxes, not with frantic energy, but with a quiet, steady purpose. Sorting his father's things became less an act of exorcism and more an act of remembrance. He found joy in small things: his dad's collection of terrible, pun-filled coffee mugs, the meticulously labeled jars of nails and screws in the garage, a box of old jazz records, scratchy but alive with the music his father loved. He fixed the wall. Carefully, he measured the cavity, cut a new piece of plasterboard, patched and sanded. The smell of sawdust, clean and woody, replaced the scent of disturbed dust and old paint. He painted over the patch, a fresh coat of white, a visual marker of healing. He kept the amber bottle for a while. It sat on the kitchen windowsill, a small amber eye catching the light. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, he picked it up. He didn't throw it away. He walked out into the tangled backyard, past the overgrown roses, to the old oak tree at the far end. He dug a small hole, tip, at the base of the trunk. He placed the bottle inside, covered it with earth, patted it down. Not a burial of the past, but a planting, acknowledging its place and letting it feed the roots of what grew next. Notch watched him from the back step, her green eyes thoughtful. Her behavior shifted too. The rigid vigilance, the low hum directed at the basement door, vanished. She seemed lighter, more at ease within the space she'd claimed. She still preferred her blanket, but she began exploring further. She'd nap in a patch of sunlight on the living room rug, investigate the open boxes Daniel was sorting, her tail held high with cautious curiosity. She started spending nights curled on the sofa beside him, or sometimes, tentatively, on the worn armchair in the corner, the one his father had always sat in. Daniel would find her there in the mornings, a small, tortoiseshell shape silhouetted against the dawn light filtering through the window, looking strangely at home. She allowed more physical contact. Not cuddles, but proximity. She'd brush against his legs when he stood at the counter, her fur soft and warm. She'd sit beside him on the step as he drank his morning coffee, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her small body. Sometimes, when he's quite lost in thought or memory, she'd jump onto the sofa, walk across his lap, and settle beside him, her purr a soft, comforting engine starting up. It wasn't demanding affection, it was offering companionship, a shared quiet. Daniel found himself talking to her less about the pain and more about the present, about the small victories, finishing a box, discovering a photo that made him laugh, the way the weak autumn sun felt warm on his face through the kitchen window. "Look at that sky, Notch," he'd say, nodding towards the vibrant oranges and pinks of sunset, like someone spilled paint. Or, "Found Dad's old fishing tackle box, smells like worms and optimism." He'd smile, a real smile, more frequent now, and sometimes, Notch would slow blink back, a silent conversation. He still avoided the basement, but the avoidance wasn't driven by terror anymore. It was respect, acknowledgement that he wasn't ready, and that was okay. He'd open the door sometimes, just a crack, letting the cool air circulate. To stand there, looking down, feeling the sadness, but also a strange sense of connection. He took it into the space, telling his father about his day, about Notch, about the slow process of untangling his life. "She's a funny one, Dad," he'd murmur. "Stubborn, like you, but good company." He felt foolish sometimes, but it also felt, right, necessary. One afternoon, sorting through a box of old tools in the garage, a space now smelling of oil and dust and possibility, not just abandonment, Daniel found it. Tucked beneath a stack of worn sandpaper, a small, flat, rectangular case. Worn leather. He opened it. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, was a harmonica. Not new, well used. The metal shone dully in the weak light. His father's harmonica. Daniel remembered early summer evenings on the porch, the soft, mournful, slightly off-key notes drifting through the twilight. He'd forgotten. He picked it up. It felt cool, solid, familiar in a way he couldn't explain. He wiped the dust off the metal plates. He raised it to his lips, hesitant, unsure. He blew, tentatively. A single, wobbly note filled the dusty garage air. Notch, who had been investigating a cobweb in the corner, looked up, her ears pricked forward, head tilted. Daniel tried again. Another note. Then another. He fumbled, trying to remember, searching for a melody buried deep in childhood memory. He found a sequence, simple, hesitant. Oh, Susanna. He played it, haltingly, the notes thin and reedy, echoing slightly in the quiet space. It wasn't good, but it was sound, life, returning to the silence. He played the simple tune again, and again, slowly, gaining a fraction of confidence. He closed his eyes, picturing his dad, sitting on the porch step, the harmonica catching the last of the sun, the notes drifting out, imperfect, but filled with a quiet contentment. He felt a pang, sharp and sweet, not just of loss, but of love. Imperfect, complicated, enduring love. When he stopped, the silence rushed back in, but it wasn't the old, crushing silence. It was a listening silence. He opened his eyes. Notch was sitting a few feet away, watching him, her green eyes reflecting the dim garage light. Her tail gave a single, slow sweep across the concrete floor. Not approval, perhaps, but acknowledgement. A recognition of the sound, of the effort, of the memory made tangible. Daniel looked at the harmonica in his hand. He looked at Notch. He looked around the garage, the boxes, the tools, the life suspended. He felt the familiar ache, but beneath it, like the first tentative notes he'd just played, was a fragile melody of acceptance. He wasn't okay. He might never be entirely okay in the way he was before. But he was here. He was breathing. He was sorting. He was remembering. He was playing a wobbly tune on his father's harmonica. And he wasn't alone. He tucked the harmonica into his pocket, the cool metal a comforting weight against his hip. He walked back towards the house. Notch falling into step beside him, a small, silent shadow matching his pace. The back door was open, the familiar scent of coffee and dust and Notch's blanket welcoming them. The basement door, just visible down the hall, was closed. Not locked, just closed. A space he would face, eventually on his own terms. He stepped inside. Notch hopped up onto her blanket, circled once, and settled down, curling into a tight ball. Daniel walked over to the kitchen window, looking out at the tangled backyard, the skeletal trees, the gray sky promising rain. He placed his hand on the cool glass. He felt the harmonica in his pocket. He heard the soft sigh of Notch breathing behind him. Life wasn't fixed. The grief wasn't gone. The house still held echoes. But the silence, the crushing, empty silence that had defined his existence for months, was truly, irrevocably over. It had been replaced by the quiet symphony of healing, the rasp of Notch cleaning her paw, the distant groan of the furnace, the whisper of wind around the eaves, the faint, remembered echo of a harmonica tune, and the steady, comforting rhythm of his own heart, beating in time with the small, purring engine of the creature who had taught him how to listen to it again. The storm had passed, not into sunshine, but into a calm, gray aftermath, fertile ground for whatever came next. He was still standing. And he wasn't alone. That, for now, was enough. Winter settled over Elm Street like a held breath. Frost etched intricate lace on the inside of the kitchen windows each morning. The skeletal trees clawed at a perpetually gray sky, and the air held a sharp, clean bite that carried the scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys. Inside the Victorian, the chill seeped through the old walls, but the silence held a different quality now. It wasn't absence, it was a quiet hum of ongoing life. The furnace groaned more frequently, a familiar bass note. The wind sighed around the eaves, a constant companion. And woven through it all was the soft, domestic symphony of Notch, the rhythmic rasp of her tongue grooming her tortoiseshell fur, the delicate tink of her collar tag against her ceramic food bowl, a recent addition, small and blue, the gentle thump when she jumped down from the sofa, and, most cherished, the soft, resonant purr that often started deep in her chest when she settled near Daniel, a vibration he felt more than heard, a grounding frequency against the world's static. The amber bottle was buried. The wall was patched and painted. The basement door remained closed, but unlocked. Daniel moved through the rooms with a steadiness that felt hard-won. He wasn't sorting frantically anymore. He was curating. The boxes were dwindling. Some things went to charity, clothes his father hadn't worn in decades, duplicate tools, chipped dishes. Some things found a place in the house. The terrible pun mugs now held Daniel's pens on the desk he'd set up in the small, sunlit nook off the living room. The jazz records were stacked near the old turntable, waiting for the day he felt ready to hear them again. The fishing tackle box sat open on the garage workbench, smelling of possibility and forgotten summers. His father's presence wasn't erased, it was integrated, acknowledged, loved, despite the complicated edges. Notch was his shadow and his anchor. She followed him from room to room, her movements fluid and quiet. She'd nap in sunbeams that managed to pierce the winter gloom, transforming patches of worn carpet into islands of warmth. She'd watch him intently as he worked at his laptop, tentative freelance graphic design gigs slowly trickling in, a fragile bridge back to his old life, rebuilt on his own terms. She still favored her blanket near the kitchen door, but it was no longer a boundary, it was her chosen hearth. More often, though, she claimed the worn armchair in the living room corner. His chair. Daniel would find her there, curled into a perfect circle, her face serene, her green eyes sometimes half open, watching the world from the throne of memory. It didn't feel like trespass. It felt like occupation. A gentle claiming. A quiet statement. This space is lived in now. By both of us. One bitterly cold Saturday, with sleet ticking against the windows like impatient fingers, Daniel decided to tackle the last frontier of neglect, the storm cellar doors. They were set into the ground at the far corner of the tangled backyard, near the old oak tree. Heavy, slanted wooden doors, thick with layers of peeling green paint, almost hidden by overgrown brambles and the skeletal remains of long-dead rose bushes. He remembered his father grumbling about them, about dampness getting in, but never actually fixing them. Daniel hadn't thought about them in years. Bundled in layers against the cold, he hacked away at the frozen brambles with loppers, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Notch watched from the relative shelter of the back porch, her tail wrapped neatly around her paws, her expression one of profound feline skepticism about this entire outdoor endeavor. The sleet stung his cheeks. It was miserable work. The wood of the doors was warped, swollen shut with years of moisture and disuse. He wrestled with the rusted metal latch, finally prying it free with a metallic shriek that echoed in the stillness. Gripping the cold, wet wood he heaved. One door groaned open reluctantly, revealing a steep, earthen ramp descending into utter blackness. The smell that wafted out was overwhelming: damp earth, deep mildew, decay, and something else, something faintly animal, and beneath it all, a ghost of that sharp, medicinal scent. His stomach lurched. He stepped back, wiping his muddy gloves on his jeans. "Just needs airing out, Notch," he called to the porch, his voice tight. "Probably full of spiders and old jars of pickles." He tried to laugh it off, but the darkness below felt heavy, oppressive in a way the basement never had, even at its worst. It felt forgotten, deliberately sealed away. He fetched a powerful flashlight from the garage. The beam cut a swath through the inky blackness as he pointed it down the ramp. Earthen walls, roots snaking through like veins. Crumbling wooden shelves lining one side, stacked with things. Shapes draped in rotten canvas. Jars, cloudy with age and grime. And at the bottom, partially obscured by shadows, a larger shape, like an old trunk or crate. The air was frigid and thick with spores. He took a step down the ramp. The earth was slick with dampness. He heard a sharp sound behind him. A chirp. Notch turned. She was no longer on the porch. She stood at the top of the open storm cellar, just beyond the sleet, her fur fluffed slightly against the cold. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring intently down into the darkness, her body rigid, her ears flat against her skull. That low, resonant hum vibrated in her throat again, the same sound she'd made at the basement door. But this time it was different. It wasn't just warning or unease. It was recognition, a deep, thrumming note of profound, almost sorrowful knowing. "Notch," Daniel whispered, the beam of his flashlight trembling slightly. "What is it?" She didn't look at him. Her gaze remained fixed on the darkness below. The hum intensified, vibrating through the cold air. Then, slowly, deliberately, she took one step down the earthen ramp. Then another. Her movements were cautious, precise, placing each paw carefully on the slick earth. She wasn't stalking. She was descending. With purpose. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs. The cold seemed to seep into his bones. He followed her, the flashlight beam bouncing erratically as he tried to keep it trained ahead of her. The smell grew stronger. The air grew colder. At the bottom of the ramp, Notch stopped. She stood before the large, shadowed shape Daniel had glimpsed. It was an old steamer trunk, covered in a thick layer of grime and fuzzy green mold. It looked decades old, maybe more. One corner was badly chewed, rodent damage, perhaps long ago. Notch circled the trunk once, slowly, sniffing intently, especially around the chewed corner. Her hum softened but didn't stop. It was a continuous, low thrum, a sound that seemed to resonate with the very earth around them. She stopped facing the trunk's latches. Then she did something extraordinary. She lifted one white-tipped paw, not to scratch, but to tap. Gently, deliberately, against the center of the trunk's lid. Tap, tap, tap. Just like she'd tapped the hallway wall. The memory slammed into Daniel. The insistent tapping. The hidden cavity. The bottle. The truth. His breath caught. This wasn't about dampness or spiders. Notch was showing him again. Revealing another layer. "Okay," he breathed, the word misting in the frigid air. "Okay, girl." He moved closer, his boots crunching on the damp earth. He shone the flashlight directly onto the trunk's latches. They were old, tarnished brass, crusted shut. He set the flashlight down on a nearby shelf, its beam illuminating Notch, still standing sentinel by the trunk, her green eyes reflecting the light like tiny beacons in the gloom. He took off his gloves, his fingers instantly numb with cold. He grasped the cold, gritty latches. They resisted. He pulled, wrenched, pried. Rust flaked off. With a protesting groan of metal and stiff leather, the latches finally gave way. He lifted the heavy lid. The smell that billowed out was a concentrated wave of the cellar's signature decay, mixed with dust, old paper, and something else. Something dry and sweet and forgotten, like pressed flowers or old books. The trunk wasn't full of junk. It was meticulously packed, though time and dampness had taken their toll. On top lay a moth-eaten woolen blanket, once probably deep red, now faded to a rusty brown. Beneath that, layers of yellowed tissue paper, brittle and disintegrating. Daniel carefully peeled them back, his numb fingers clumsy. Beneath the paper, photographs. Dozens of them. Loose, curling at the edges, sepia-toned and black and white. Pictures of people in stiff, formal poses. People he didn't recognize. Ancestors, perhaps. Then he froze. His fingers brushed against a larger photograph, protected by a stiff cardboard folder, slightly warped but intact. He pulled it out. It was a picture of his father. Much younger. Maybe in his late 20s. He was sitting on the back steps of this very house, grinning broadly, squinting slightly in the sunlight. He wasn't alone. On his lap, a small, wriggling blur of fur. A kitten. Tortoiseshell. A kitten with a distinctively notched ear. And beside them on the step, leaning against his father's leg, looking up at the kitten with an expression of pure, youthful delight, was a boy. A boy of about 6 or 7. Daniel. Himself. He stared. The world tilted. The cold, the damp, the oppressive darkness of the cellar, it all receded. There was only the photograph. The irrefutable evidence held in his trembling hands. His father's relaxed, happy posture, so different from the stern man he remembered. The kitten's tiny, fuzzy form. His own childhood face, open and unguarded, radiating joy at the small creature. He'd had a cat. His father, the man who didn't like independent critters, had let him have a cat. A tortoiseshell kitten. Nutch. Or her ancestor? Her grandmother? The dates swam in his head. His father had been young. He'd been a child. The kitten? It must have been before his mother got sick? Before the world hardened around his father? A time Daniel had buried deep, overshadowed by later years of quiet tension and loss. He remembered fragments. Sunlight. Laughter. A tiny, purring bundle tucked against his neck. A frantic search, tears, his father's face grim. Ran of the cats do that. Independent critters. He'd believed it. Buried the grief of losing the kitten under the later, larger griefs. He'd forgotten her. Utterly. But his father had kept this picture. Hidden away. Protected. In this trunk, buried in the storm cellar, sealed up with memories he couldn't bear to revisit, perhaps? A relic of a happier, softer time before life dealt its blows? Nutch. The cat who had appeared on his step, scarred, independent, profoundly perceptive, with a notch in her ear. A stray? Or a descendant? Drawn back? Was it possible? The coincidence was staggering, impossible, yet the photograph screamed its truth. He looked down at Notch. She was no longer looking at the trunk. She was looking up at him. Her green eyes held that ancient, knowing depth. She gave a soft MRP, a sound that wasn't a question, but an affirmation. See? The pieces clicked together with a force that stole his breath. Her intense reaction to the basement, the the place of his father's end. Her focus on the wall where the pills were hidden, the symbol of his father's hidden pain. Her profound understanding of his grief. It wasn't just feline intuition. It was a legacy, a connection woven through time and loss. Whether she was the direct descendant of that long-lost kitten or some impossible echo didn't matter. She was his, sent back, or drawn back, to this house, to him, in his darkest hour, to show him the love that had been hidden, the pain that needed facing, and now, this final piece, the forgotten joy, the proof of a softer past. Daniel sank to his knees on the cold, damp earth beside the open trunk. He didn't care about the cold or the grime. He held the photograph to his chest, the cardboard folder cool against his flannel shirt. Tears welled, hot against his cold cheeks. Not grief this time. Not guilt. Profound, staggering awe. And gratitude so immense it felt like a physical pressure in his chest. Notch stepped closer. She bumped her head gently against his knee, then against the hand clutching the photograph. A soft, rumbling purr started deep in her chest, louder than he'd ever heard it. It filled the small, cold space, a warm, resonant counterpoint to the silence of the forgotten cellar. It was a purr of belonging, of a circle closing, of a story reaching back through decades to find its continuation. He reached out a trembling hand, not to pick her up, but to gently touch the notch in her ear. The mark of survival, the mark of homecoming. She leaned into the touch for a brief moment, a silent acceptance, before stepping back slightly, her purr softening but not stopping. He looked around the cellar, the beam of the flashlight catching motes of dust dancing in the still air. The shelves held relics of other lives, other times. But the trunk, this photograph, Notch, they were his relics, his truth. He carefully placed the photograph back in its folder, nestled it under the woolen blanket within the trunk. He didn't need to keep it out. He had its image seared into his soul. He closed the heavy lid, the latches clicking softly this time. He picked up the flashlight. "Come on, Notch," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Let's go home." She turned immediately, patting up the earthen ramp ahead of him, her tail held high. He followed, closing the heavy storm cellar doors behind them, latching them shut against the sleet. The cold air hit him like a slap after the cellar's dank stillness, but it felt clean, cleansing. Back inside the warm kitchen, Daniel peeled off his muddy layers. Notch sat on her blanket, meticulously cleaning a paw, as if the descent into the forgotten cellar had been nothing more than a brief, damp excursion. He made tea, the familiar ritual grounding him. He sat at the table, the steam warming his face, looking at Notch. She looked back, blinking slowly. He reached into the drawer where he kept important papers, the deed to the house, his father's will. He pulled out a single sheet he'd printed weeks ago but hadn't quite been ready to finalize. It was an adoption certificate from the local shelter, a symbolic gesture he'd considered. He picked up a pen. Under pet's name, he wrote, firmly, Notch. Under previous name, if known, he paused. He looked at her. She blinked again. He wrote, found. He filled in the rest. His name, the address, the date. He signed it with a flourish that felt like a vow. Not a claim of ownership, but a declaration, a recognition. She wasn't just a stray he'd fed. She wasn't just a comfort in grief. She was family. Unexpected. Imperfect. Wild-hearted. But family. A living link to a forgotten past and a fragile, hopeful present. He placed the certificate on the fridge, held by a magnet shaped like a tiny, grinning skull, a relic from his city life that felt incongruous and right. Notch hopped onto the counter, a new boldness, and sniffed at the paper. She gave it a cursory glance, then nudged his hand with her head. He scratched behind her notched ear, feeling the rumble of her purr vibrate through his fingers. The storm cellar's secret was kept. The photograph remained buried with its blanket. But the knowledge, the profound understanding of Notch's connection, however impossible, however mystical, it changed everything. Her presence wasn't random. Her knowing wasn't just instinct. She was the final gift. The last piece of the puzzle his father, in his own way, had left for him to find. Not just to heal the present, but to reclaim a fragment of the past's forgotten light. She was the bridge. And as he stood there, the sleet ticking against the window, his hand on the warm fur of the cat who had saved him, Daniel knew exactly what his final gift to her, and to the memory of that lost kitten, would be. He pulled out his phone. Not for social media. Not for work. He opened a browser and typed, "Local animal shelter volunteer opportunities." He scrolled, his thumb hovering. Then he clicked, "Feline care assistant." He filled out the form. His name, his address, his phone number. Under reason for interest, he paused only a moment before typing, paying it forward. For a second chance. For Notch. He hit submit. The confirmation screen glowed. Notch, sensing his shift in focus, bumped his hand again, demanding attention. He smiled, a real, full smile that reached his eyes, and scooped her gently off the counter, holding her warm, purring body close. He carried her into the living room, towards the armchair. He sat down, settling her onto his lap. She curled immediately, tucking her nose under her crooked tail, her purr intensifying. Outside, the gray winter light faded. Inside, Daniel sat in his father's chair, the rescued cat who was a piece of his own forgotten childhood purring on his lap, the adoption certificate a silent testament on the fridge, and the knowledge of the shelter volunteer form submitted glowing like a tiny ember in the gathering dusk. The past wasn't gone. The grief wasn't erased. But the circle, the impossible, beautiful circle, was finally, irrevocably complete. Notch had brought him the final piece. Now he would honor it. One rescued cat, one act of kindness at a time. The gift wasn't just revealed, it was accepted. And it was just beginning. The first snow fell on Elm Street the morning Daniel started volunteering at the shelter. It wasn't a dramatic storm, just a quiet, steady drift of flakes, muffling the world in soft silence. The Victorian house, with its patched walls and unlocked basement door, stood wrapped in white, smoke curling from the chimney. Inside, Daniel laced up his boots while Notch watched from the windowsill, her breath fogging the glass as she tracked the falling snow with those luminous green eyes. He knelt beside her, running a hand down her back, still marveling at how she allowed it now, how she sometimes even leaned into his touch. "You'll have the place to yourself for a few hours," he murmured, scratching under her chin. "No wild parties while I'm gone." She blinked slowly at him, unimpressed, then flicked her notched ear as if shooing him away. The shelter was a squat brick building on the edge of town, smelling of antiseptic and kibble and the faint, hopeful scent of laundry detergent. The coordinator, a woman named Marjorie with silver-streaked hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, handed him a laminated checklist. "Feed the cats in room 3. Clean litter boxes. Socialize the shy ones. Don't force it, let them come to you." Daniel nodded, glancing at the rows of cages. Dozens of eyes watched him, some wary, some curious, some resigned. A scrawny orange tabby pressed against the bars, chirping. A black cat with one ear missing turned its back. A tiny gray kitten batted at a toy mouse with single-minded determination. He knew that look, that stubborn will to survive. He got to work. This was never just about a man and a cat. It was about how grief carves hollows into us, spaces so deep we think nothing could ever fill them. It was about the quiet, persistent love of creatures who don't demand explanations, who don't need words to understand the shape of our pain. It was about the way the past never truly leaves us, how it lingers in photographs tucked away, in echoes of laughter sealed beneath cellar doors, in the ghosts of kittens long gone but never forgotten. Notch wasn't just a stray. She was a bridge. Between past and present, between loss and healing, between a father and son who never got to say the things they needed to. And Daniel? He wasn't just a man feeding a cat. He was learning, slowly, painfully, that love doesn't end with death. That forgiveness isn't something you're given, but something you claw your way toward, one small act of kindness at a time. Winter melted into spring. The snow receded, revealing muddy earth and the first brave shoots of green. The boxes in the house were gone, sorted, donated, or kept. The basement door stayed unlocked. Daniel went down once, on a bright April morning, Notch padding at his heels. He didn't stay long, just long enough to open the small, high window, letting in fresh air and sunlight. Long enough to say quietly, "I miss you, Dad." Notch sat at the foot of the stairs, watching him. Not guarding, not warning, just waiting. When he climbed back up, she followed. The shelter volunteer work became routine. Every Saturday, Daniel cleaned cages, filled bowls, and sat with the shyest cats, the ones who hid in the backs of their enclosures, the ones who flinched at sudden movements. He didn't rush them. He let them set the pace. One afternoon, as he refilled water dishes, Marjorie sidled up beside him. "You're good at this," she said, nodding toward a once feral tabby now cautiously sniffing his fingers. "You've got patience." Daniel shrugged. "I had a good teacher." At home, Notch greeted him at the door, not with meows or demands, but with a slow blink and the barest flick of her tail. She didn't need grand gestures. She never had. That night, as Daniel lay on the sofa, Notch curled on his chest, her purr vibrating through his ribs, he realized something. He wasn't waiting anymore. Not for the grief to fade completely. Not for the guilt to vanish. Not for some grand moment of closure. He was just living. And that was enough. The last box, the one marked Dad's desk, sat in the corner of the study for weeks before Daniel opened it. When he finally did, on a rainy evening in May, he found exactly what he expected: pens, paper clips, a broken pocket watch, a stack of unpaid bills. And at the very bottom, tucked beneath a yellowed notepad, an envelope. His name was on the front. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting achingly familiar. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. And if I'm gone, then we probably didn't get to say the things we should have. So here it is. I'm proud of you. Even when I didn't say it. Even when we fought. You were always your own person, and that's what matters. The store, the city, none of it was as important as you thinking for yourself. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry. For the arguments. For the stubbornness. For not telling you sooner. The house is yours now. Do with it what you want. Just don't let it become a museum. Liven it. Fill it with something good." Daniel read it 3 times. Then he folded it carefully, slipped it back into the envelope, and pressed it to his chest. Notch, who had been watching from the armchair, hopped down and walked over. She nudged his knee with her head, once, firmly, then leapt onto the desk, settling atop the scattered papers as if to say, "Enough sorting. Enough digging. Just be here." Daniel reached out, running a finger over the notch in her ear. She purred. Outside, the rain slowed to a drizzle. The first fireflies of the season flickered in the wet grass. The house, no longer a tomb of memories, but a home, stood quiet and warm. And in that stillness, Daniel understood the final lesson Notch had been teaching him all along. Some loves don't end. They just change shape. If this story moved you, if you felt that ache in your chest, that warmth in your heart, then you understand. You understand that grief is not a straight line, that healing is not a destination, but a slow unfolding, that sometimes the most profound love comes on quiet pause, slipping into your life when you least expect it. So here's my question for you. Who or what has been your Notch? The stray who found you when you were lost? The love that refused to let you drown? The unexpected light in your darkest moment? Tell me in the comments. Share this story with someone who needs it. And if you want more tales like this, stories that don't just entertain, but stitch something back together inside you, then hit that subscribe button, ring the bell icon, and join me every week for another journey into the quiet, beautiful, heartbreaking, healing power of love. Because the world is full of notches. You just have to be ready to see them. Goodbye for now, but not forever.